Every professional retoucher has his favorite techniques for sharpening, local contrast, and detail enhancement, because this is a very important step of the post-production workflow. And this is why we have inside the Mindthecolor extension Contr D, a dedicated area in which you will find a lot of tools for making your image sharper and more three-dimensional. Let's take a look. First thing I need to tell you is that when we click on the Contr D button, here in this area we have all the tools for sharpening and local contrast. But here, if you click on these three small points, we have additional tools for contrast enhancement that we will see at the end of this video. Now, before we start, I would like to show you something about the Unsharp Mask. Let me call the Unsharp Mask filter. We all know that when we need to apply the Unsharp Mask, we need to adjust the settings according to the results we want. So if we use a small radius and a high intensity like this, for example, let me sample this area, what we have is sharpening. So I can increase even more the radius and you can see what we have. Let me zoom in so we can see what's going on. And when I increase the radius, let's say from 1 to 2, the sharpening is becoming more evident. So the basic rule of the Unsharp Mask filter is that when we use a small radius and a high amount, we have sharpening. But when we increase the radius, something like this, maybe this even more, the effect changes. And we have one of the biggest issues with the Unsharp Mask filter, that are light and dark halos that you can see here in our image. That's before and that's after. These halos were already present when the radius was small, but now that the radius is much bigger, they become more visible, of course. But if we increase even more the radius, then the halos becomes bigger. Let's say something around this, or even this. And the final result begins to look more like a contrast enhancement rather than sharpening, even if the global contrast has not been touched, because we haven't used any curves or something like this to enhance the contrast. And this is what I mean. This is before and this is after. And this is why the use of the Unsharp Mask or any other similar filter that is good for making the same kind of techniques is called local contrast. Or if you want to give it a name, I suggest you use Hyralome as a name. And Hyralome is a term that was created many years ago by Dan Margulis and stands for high radius and low amount. Anyhow, with this kind of move, if you want to use the Unsharp Mask filter in this way, we usually must decrease the amount until the effect is not so evident. Something like this can be fine. So I'm going to click OK. And now it's evident that the Unsharp Mask filter, that's before and that's after, used in this way enhances the detail and gives a more three-dimensional image, but we have the halos issue that must be managed in some way. Let me go back. And now, the Mindthecolor extension can help you to solve this problem with the algorithm number 1. So when I increase the radius, for example, to, let's say, a radius similar to the one we have just used, maybe around 130. Okay, you can see what we get is only the bright halos. This is before and this is after. And if I increase the amount, of course, we will have the issue, because the default value for the amount is 25. So if I go back to 135, you can see how much I see the halos. But I can experiment with all these settings and say I want to keep only the bright halos, maybe around 47. So when we use algorithm number 1, what we have is similar to the Unsharp Mask filter used in Hyroloom. Of course, we have only the light halos that are still visible in some areas where we have a very strong contrast, like for example around the hair of the girl. And this can be avoided using a mask, for example, and with a very large brush, something like maybe this, I can paint with a black. And see, let me turn on the visibility of this mask. Okay, so that's without the mask, and this is with the mask. And that's the final result. This is before and this is after. So I keep the bright halos where I need them, but I hide the bright halos by adding a mask, painting it with a black soft brush, where I don't want to see them. Now, we can switch to the second algorithm, that is algorithm number 2 here. And here, for example, I want to apply algorithm number 2 with the different settings. Maybe I can increase the radius, something like this. And you see, okay, this is too much, I would say, so I can lower the amount, like this, for example, or something around 20. You can see what the algorithm number 2 does is to add only the dark halos to the image. And this is a smart approach, because if I change the settings, I can have different results for the light and dark halos. And this, of course, gives me more flexibility. Also, the nice thing is that the layer with the algorithm 2 is obtained after the algorithm 1 is applied. So the algorithm 2 includes all the light halos we have painted and masked here. Now, before switching to algorithm number 3, let me save a snapshot here. I'm gonna name this alg 1 plus 2. And I'm gonna throw away these 2 layers. So now I can choose algorithm 3 and click on the button Run. And what I get is this warning. Before going on, what Photoshop is telling me is that it's going to convert my document into LAB. Why this? Because algorithm number 3 is a different animal. It's very different from number 1 and number 2. Has more complex calculations, has also a setting for reducing the halos, and works into the LAB color mode. Now, if you don't know how it works, LAB, you should know that it's very different from the usual color modes, like, for example, RGB or CMYK. So if I click yes, from now on, my document will be converted into LAB color mode. And this will mean that I will lose some steps of my workflow. For example, all the adjustment layers made in RGB or CMYK, whatever, they will be lost because some adjustment layers, like for example even curves or hue saturation, works in a very different mode in LAB from RGB or CMYK. So if I click yes, from now on I will lose some of the previous steps of my file, and the document will be converted into LAB color mode, and the algorithm number 3 will be applied. The second option is to click no, of course, make a copy, a duplicate of my image, run the algorithm number 3, and then copy the result back into my original file. And of course, my suggestion goes for the second option. So I'm going to click no on this warning. I'm going to duplicate my file. I'm going to call it LAB. And now I'm going to click run and apply these settings to my image. And that's before and that's after. Of course, the result is very different from the previous one because also the radius is smaller. So I'm going to increase the radius around 130, 145. So we can compare the two images. That's before and that's after. And you can see that the result is very different. I can increase the remove halos setting and see what I get. Okay. I'm going to push this to the maximum value. Maybe around 350. So I'm going to drag this layer back into my original file and look at the results. So this is, let me save a snapshot here. This is algorithm number 3, and this is algorithm number 1 and 2. Of course, you can see the result is much different. I would say that we have more local contrast with the algorithm number 3, even if I don't see so much the halos. Or maybe I can go back into the LAB and run the algorithm number 3 at a smaller radius, like this, for example. Okay, I would say this is good. Let me drag this back. So that's before, and this is with the algorithm number 3. These are my previous settings. I would say those settings are better. So I'm gonna throw this layer. And now let's see how this algorithm number 3 works on different kind of images. For example, in an image like this. So I'm going to press the run button. In this case, I don't have any previous step, so I can convert this to LAB. And I would say the result is pretty good. I like the effect on the dresses. I have more detail, but I still see some halos. So let me increase the remove halos. Yes, much better, I would say. Let me increase the radius and see what I get. Well, definitely better, I would say. I have a nice detail in the dresses and I don't have any light halos around the girl anymore. So I would say this version is better. Now let me show you what the dynamic range parameter does. So I'm going to increase this. I would say nice because I have more detail in the dresses. And let me increase even more the dynamic range. Okay, maybe too much. Something in the middle, like this. Well, I would say this version is the best one. Okay, so basically what the dynamic range does, you can see it, is lightening the shadows. And this can be very helpful in fashion images, for example, like this one. Or maybe it can be very helpful in dark images when we want to add some local contrast, make the image more three-dimensional, but we want to keep some visibility in the shadows, so some detail in the shadows. Let's check how it works on different images. Okay, maybe on an image like this, I'm going to run the algorithm number 3 with the same settings. Okay, convert to LAB. And you can see that the effect is pretty good. We have more detail, more contrast. You see the image pops up. And now let's increase the dynamic range. And we have more visibility into the shadows. Let me increase too much. Maybe this is too much. So I'm gonna lower this to something like this, 10. And let's see what we have when we play with the radius as well. Okay, definitely better. That's before and that's after. You can see how more three-dimensional the image looks. Maybe what I don't like is the effect on the face that adds some darkness here into the face. But as the algorithm number 3 already has a layer mask, I can paint with a soft brush like this, maybe 50% black on the mask. Okay. And that's without the mask, that's with the mask, and this is the mask. Maybe I can paint also with the black to reduce the effect on the face. Okay, so that's before and that's after. And I would say this is a very good local contrast enhancement, and we still have all the detail in the dark areas. Now let's take a look at what the press 1 and press 2 button do. You can see here, for example, that press 1 stands for preset 1. That means preset algorithm 1, so highlights, and the press 2 is the preset for the algorithm number 2 that adds the shadows, the dark halos to an image. So I'm going to choose a different image like this. Now, these presets are not for who wants the maximum control, but can be very useful for people that must produce good enough result in a very short time. For example, I'm going to press the press 1 button, and you can see here what we have are the light halos. I would say in an image like this is not the best result. I'm going to throw away this layer. I'm going to click the press 2. Okay, definitely better. That's before and that's after. Now let's see what happens in the previous image. So I'm going to throw away this layer and run the press 1. Okay, so I am converting back my image into RGB, and for example also press 2. That's the original image. This is the preset 1, and this is the preset 1 with the preset 2. Maybe again I can add a mask here and paint with a black brush over the face. Okay, so that's before and that's after. And yes, as you can see, the result is worth the time, because just 2 clicks and we have a more three-dimensional image in a matter of seconds. Okay, so now that we have seen all the sharpening and local contrast tools, we can take a look at the additional features in the Contr D area. There are the 4 additional buttons. Now, those buttons works slightly differently from the other ones, because they affect the global contrast, not the local contrast. Let me show you. And also remember that we must always click on these 3 small points to show the 4 additional buttons. Now, CMX and CMX1 add a channel mixer layer set in luminosity mode that affects the contrast globally. You can see that's before and that's after. So let me save a snapshot here. I'm gonna name this CMX, and then throw this layer and run the CMX1 and check what I get here. So this is CMX and this is CMX1. Well, the 2 effects are slightly different because the biggest difference I see is that in one we have more blue and less red. That is CMX1, and in the CMX I have red that is higher around 10% and the blue that is lower around 10%. So again, 2 different versions made with just 1 click. But the nice thing is that when I have a channel mixer set in luminosity mode, I can play with all the red, green and blue settings. For example, here you can see that I recover a lot of detail in the girl's face. And this is before and this is after. Maybe this is too dark, of course. And I can play also with the red. So I can, for example, raise the red and lower the blue again. And I can continue to play with the other sliders until I get what I like. And again, this is before and this is after. you can see how the contrast has radically changed. Now, here is a matter of taste. You can play with all these sliders until you get the result you like. Now, let's take a look at the GRD button. I'm gonna change the image. And when I click on the GRD button, what I get is a gradient map set in luminosity mode at 40% opacity. And this is another way of playing with contrast because I can change this layer by clicking here on the gradient and moving, for example, the black slider. When I move the black slider of the gradient to the right, you can see that the image becomes darker. And also when I play, for example, with the white to the left, the highlights become lighter. And I can play also with the gray. Moving the gray into the gradient to the left or to the right. And when I'm fine, I can click OK. And that's before and that's after. Very simple, very easy, but anyway, another way of increasing the contrast. And last button I want to show you is the BWC. So I'm gonna throw away this layer. And when I click on the BWC, what I get is a black and white adjustment layer set in soft light. And here I can play on the single sliders to change the contrast. Now, this is not the right image because we have more or less all the same colors here. So I'm gonna switch back to the previous image. I'm gonna throw away those layers and I'm gonna press the BWC button. And now you can see here I can play with all these sliders. For example, if I lower the yellows and the red, you can see that actually I am recovering some detail in the girl's face. Or for example, I can play with the cyan to lighten the sky. Maybe also the blue. Okay, I like dark skies, for example, here. And that's before and that's after. Now, as we have reds and yellows, maybe this is a tool that can be useful with portraits. So I'm going to switch back on my first image, like this one. Here we have a Contr D still active, and I can run the BWC button, and this is what I get. Here I can play, for example, with the reds and also the yellows. Yeah, you can see how effective this is. So I can lighten the face very much. Or maybe I can load a luminosity mask, for example. Here, let me run the L mask. Okay, I'm gonna select the bitmap layer. And check what I get here. Okay, maybe I can use a light. Okay, a light mask. So I'm gonna switch back to the RGB. I'm gonna click on the black and white layers mask. And I'm gonna use the apply image. And use, for example, the S-light mask. Okay, that's before. And that's after. Okay. And this is the mask I'm using. Maybe I can lighten even more the mask. So I can darken the shadows in the mask and lighten, add in some contrast. Okay, I do like the final effect. And you can see how we can play with all these settings. And so that's the original image, and this is the image we have using the black and white BWC button and the algorithm number 3. Of course, I can group this layer, and if I don't like the final result, I can always lower the opacity and so on. Well, I think you now get the idea. With all the tools available inside the Contr D area of the Mindthecolor extension, we have a lot of possibilities to enhance and control both global and local contrast. And at the same time, we can reduce the typical artifacts of the Unsharp Mask filter as well. Plus, with all these options available and the customization of every single parameter, we can really control the effect and produce images that can gain a lot of detail and become more three-dimensional in a matter of just few clicks.